seconds to get your definitions down. All right, and that is time. So we're going to return to those definitions in just a moment, so don't set them aside. Now, intersectionality is a pretty fascinating term. It was coined by the Black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's meant to capture the notion that some epistemic agents experience multiple interlocking systems of oppression. And to motivate her view of intersectionality, Crenshaw offers us the example of a lawsuit filed against General Motors by a group of Black women in 1976. Now, these Black women sued on the basis that GM separated its workforce by race and by gender. Some jobs were exclusively open to men, others were only open to women. Now, the problem is that the jobs Blacks were allowed to work were the men's jobs, and the jobs that whites were allowed to work were the women's jobs. So Black women found themselves without a place for employment at GM. They couldn't work the floor because that was a man's job. So even though they were Black, because they weren't men, they couldn't work the floor. Nor could they work the secretarial jobs, even though they were women, because they were Black, and those jobs were secured for white people. But ultimately what happened is that this case was dismissed on the basis that the court said that plaintiffs couldn't file both race and gender claims. And so essentially here, Black women fell through the cracks because there was no legal precedent to support them and do them justice. In this sense then, intersectionality is best thought of as a theory of oppression that examines the harm that arises when we use monistic definitions of race, gender, class, and so on that cash them out as mutually exclusive categories. But how well does this map on to that definition of intersectionality that you wrote down? Many of you may have written down that intersectionality refers to inclusivity, or the idea of having lots of different people with lots of different backgrounds all at the table. And the reason that you might have written that down as the definition is because that is now what intersectionality has come to mean through repeated misuse of the term. Crenshaw herself has even observed this problem, stating that she is, and I quote, amazed at how intersectionality gets over and underused. Sometimes I can't even recognize it in the literature anymore, end quote. Now, of course, it would be completely reasonable to wonder at this point why it really matters that these terms end up meaning something just slightly different than what was intended. But consider, being able to conceptualize gaslighting forewarns against it. But obfuscation of this language may disguise the fact that one is participating in or being subject to the very behavior that the term originally picked out. Or consider instead that, as Anna Karastathis writes, and I quote again, ironically, some deployments of intersectionality may serve to obscure and thereby reproduce the very phenomena intersectionality was conceived to illuminate and overcome, end quote. So my concern fully articulated is this. Certain words and phrases, like gaslighting and intersectionality, pick out a specific and distinct phenomenon, one which captures the experiences of those who are socially marginalized. But inattention to the origins and intent of these words causes them to take on a more capacious meaning. This then undermines the usefulness of those terms for the communities responsible for their creation. And so consequently, what we find is that marginalized knowers may lose all means of expressing or communicating these concepts, and by extension, their own experiences. Now again, this is still just a bit vague. I've outlined some examples that I think help us get a better grasp on what precisely hermeneutic theft is. But more needs to be said still about what precisely the harm of hermeneutic theft is. And so in order to do that, I want to situate hermeneutic theft in relation to two similar epistemic harms: linguistic hijacking and epistemic appropriation. Now, I believe that in appealing to these accounts, I can more aptly extrapolate the harm of hermeneutic theft. So let's start with linguistic hijacking. Linguistic hijacking pretty much is what it sounds like. As defined by Derek Anderson, who coined the term, it involves the semantic corruption of a politically significant piece of language. And by semantic corruption, he means that a word's meaning becomes distorted such that however the dominant use it, that's the meaning that the word takes on. Now, obviously, this can happen for some of the same reasons that I alluded to earlier in the talk. Namely, the dominant have a greater influence over our shared epistemic resources and what those shared epistemic resources entail and attend to and mean. And so as an example of this phenomenon, Anderson invites us to think of misuse of the term racist, as in affirmative action policies are racist. On a definition of racism that's becoming more and more prevalent among dominantly situated communities, that reading seems right. And so what happens is the word racist becomes increasingly useless in picking out the types of things that we really think are racist, and then misidentifies things that we might not think of racist as racist. And so the harm of this kind of hijacking, according to Anderson, is that it involves the misuse of language that's important to communities that are marginalized in such a way that it both benefits the powerful and furthers the oppression of those who are already marginalized. Now, there are at least two things I think worth noting here. The first is that though hermeneutic theft and linguistic hijacking both involve similar harms, they are distinct in that my target is language specifically created by and for marginalized groups, rather than politically significant speech. The second is this. In distinguishing hermeneutic harm from linguistic hijacking, we can see that the harm of hermeneutic theft is that it undermines the epistemic agency of those who created the term. So that is to say, in developing the ameliorative resources necessary to address a hermeneutical injustice, marginalized knowers are reasserting themselves into the epistemic playing field. They're making significant epistemic contributions that facilitate all of our understanding, not just the understanding of marginalized people, but intercommunal understanding. But hermeneutic theft undermines this project by making those contributions useless, or at least minimally by altering or misrepresenting what those contributions are. Now, still more can be said about the harm of hermeneutic theft if we look at yet another kind of harm, what Emma Lund Davis has called epistemic appropriation. Now, epistemic appropriation involves two components, epistemic detachment and epistemic misdirection. Now, Davis defines epistemic detachment as occurring when the marginalized epistemic agents responsible for the development of an epistemic resource are divorced from their epistemic contributions. And epistemic misdirection happens when the benefits of those resources are funneled away from the marginalized and towards the dominant. So as an example, Davis describes a scenario in which a woman, knowing that her contributions won't be well received in a meeting, writes them down and passes them to a sympathetic male colleague. That sympathetic male colleague then shares her contribution in the meeting. That colleague is then praised for being an innovative thinker who drives progress and makes the company better. Now here, the woman has been detached from her contribution and that she needed her male colleague to make it. And the benefits of that contribution are directed away from her, the person who actually made the contribution, and towards her male colleague who merely spoke the suggestion. I believe part of the harm of hermeneutic theft is that it too, like epistemic appropriation, involves epistemic detachment. In hermeneutic theft, the marginalized community responsible for the creation of an ameliorative resource is detached from their contributions such that we lose the historic origin of that resource. And so it's in virtue of this detachment that we forget the purpose for which the resource was created, and that allows for the continued semantic corruption of the term. Now, there's one final thing I'd like to say here that I hope will both illustrate why hermeneutic theft is harmful and give yet another concrete example of hermeneutic theft at play. And this does require saying a little bit about how one might object to the view that I'm trying to develop here. Now, one might not unreasonably raise the worry that theft of ameliorative resources is not willful or malicious and might demonstrate nothing more than a misunderstanding of the proper referent of the language developed by marginalized communities. But to see that this is not the case, consider appropriation or theft of the anti-racist slogan Black Lives Matter by dominantly situated groups and communities. Now, as we've seen, this slogan has been taken up and repackaged as either All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. Now, part of the explanation for the response All Lives Matter is the thought that some groups are hearing Black Lives Matter as suggesting only Black Lives Matter, rather than the intended Black Lives Matter too. But what I want to focus on actually involves Blue Lives Matter, not All Lives Matter. To my knowledge, and I am willing to be corrected if I'm wrong, to my knowledge, no one has inaccurately or has inaccurately understood what Blue Lives Matter is saying. No one has responded to Blue Lives Matter by saying all occupations matter, all careers matter, which is a reasonable interpretation if we're hearing Black Lives Matter in an exclusive key. One might reasonably think that Blue Lives Matter, which uses the same semantic construction, would be interpreted in that spirit as well. And yet it's not. And so what the asymmetry here tells me is that understanding in the case of Black Lives Matter is being deliberately withheld. And if we want to understand why it's being deliberately withheld in one case and not the other, we need to look no further than at the social identities of those people responsible for the production of that slogan. Now, here's what I think that we can learn from this. The asymmetric evaluation of Black versus Blue Lives Matter is particularly powerful in demonstrating the harm of hermeneutic theft because it shows us the similarity between this and cultural appropriation. Just as cultural appropriation involves stealing or in some way using the culture of a subordinated group against them, so too does hermeneutic theft involve borrowing some feature or expression of a marginalized community while simultaneously penalizing the originating community for that expression. Hermeneutic theft in this sense, I want to suggest, constitutes a form of silencing. Now, silencing is a form of epistemic violence that Christy Dotson argues damages a given group's ability to speak and be heard. When dominantly situated knowers and groups successfully appropriate an ameliorative epistemic resource, they place marginalized communities in a position where, once again, they're unable to communicate their experiences. Thus, with all of these on the table, I think I'm in a better position to more fully specify the harm of hermeneutic theft. First, it's harmful in that it involves the semantic corruption of an ameliorative epistemic resource, which is to say that it involves the corruption of a term that was meant to address an injustice. Second, it involves the detachment of these resources from the community responsible for their creation, such that we lose the relationship between the word and its origin. Finally, it results in silencing, by which I mean it returns the marginalized to a position where they are once again unable to describe fundamental aspects of their experiences of oppression. Thus, if the goal is to prevent epistemic agents of a certain kind, namely marginalized epistemic agents, from speaking and being heard, then hermeneutical theft is successful in bringing about this end. So just to close, my goal here has merely been to show that hermeneutic theft is a multifaceted phenomenon that compounds the epistemic harm suffered by already epistemically marginalized communities. Examining such practices is essential to the work that philosophy is doing, though. Examining practices like hermeneutic theft, practices in which the epistemic contributions of marginalized communities are misused, distorted, misrepresented, or undermined, better allows us to understand the myriad ways in which the socially powerful may attempt to restore unequal social relations. And, most importantly, it puts us on guard against such efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toole, for that fascinating talk. And we have several questions in the Q&A queue. I want to encourage everybody who has any question, don't be shy, put it in there. I will do my best to get to all of them here tonight. So the first question I have here, Dr. Toole, is I think something you touched on. But if there's anything else you want to say about it, okay. If not, you can just let me know. This is from Sanem Sanair. Is Blue Lives Matter a case of hermeneutical theft specifically?
Yep. I do, in fact, have another paper called Holding Resistance Hostage, where I go into much more depth on just Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. But yes, absolutely, I consider that a form of theft. And I think it's a particularly helpful illustration of the thing that I'm talking about. And I did not touch on this in the talk, because it is such a great illustration of how rhetoric can be appropriated in the same way that culture is. So the definition that I gave of cultural appropriation doesn't just say that it involves stealing someone's culture, but that it involves stealing their culture and punishing them for it. So we see the Kardashians rocking box braids, even though we required the Crown Act in 2020 to make it okay for Black women to wear braids at work. That's cultural appropriation. And in the same vein, here's what we've seen with Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been unpopular. That changed a little bit over the summer, but we've seen the numbers decline again, which I think is unsurprising, and I can touch on that if anyone has a question about it. But what's interesting is where Black Lives Matter activists are decried as thugs and rioters and anarchists, Blue Lives Matter has been really incredibly well received. They've been very successful in some of the things they've aimed to accomplish. So for instance, in Louisiana, it is now a hate crime to attack a police officer. That's Blue Lives Matter lobbying at work. And so, yes, I think it's an excellent example of precisely the kind of phenomenon that I am identifying here.
Thank you. Next question from an anonymous attendee. So you mentioned the legal case specifically that did not take into account intersectionality. Are there any current or other legal cases that you know of that have benefited from a better understanding of intersectionality that have been present in a case?
Any cases where intersectionality has also been in play? I'm sorry, anonymous, as I am not a legal scholar, no, I actually don't know. But I can't imagine that there aren't cases where it's happening. And it definitely seems to me to be true to say that a failure to think about intersectionality in the way that it was meant by Kimberly Crenshaw, we have seen that play out in politics, right? So one party says, hey, look, we've got women. And it's like, okay, well, you've got like white, wealthy women, but that's not what all women are like. Women from lower class backgrounds, women of color, women who are non-native English speakers, they're all gonna have very different things to say about what they as women need. And so I think that those are pretty clear cases. A lot of our laws, legal terminology is still being decided in this way, where intersectionality means just including some women rather than thinking about how women are oppressed in many different respects based on their class, their religious affiliation, their sexual identity, and so on.
Thank you. So this is another question from a different anonymous attendee about cultural appropriation. Can you, I know you touched on one with the Kardashians, but can you give another example of a cultural appropriation that's prominent for you and in your thinking?
Because I am newly arrived in California, so I've only been here in just a little over a year, I guess Coachella really sticks out. So I get having never been to Coachella and only witnessed pictures at Sea and Burning Man, I think that's the other one, I get the impression that the popular thing to do at these festivals is to wear Native American headdresses and other such accoutrements. And that also seems to me like a harmful form of appropriation, because it is still the case, for instance, that Native Americans are at a higher rate of suicide because their culture is still undervalued and undermined and not taught in schools. So that's a really well-known one. The other example that I give in my work, and I always like to share when I have failed as an individual, because I want to make it clear that that just is what it is to be a human being. I loved Elvis so much. I was so into that hip thrusting. I just thought his music was great. And then some girlfriends broke my heart and told me that he stole his music from several blues artists that came before him. And I looked it up, and it's true. It's true. He became famous singing music that Black women and men had been singing for a long time before him. So that's another instance of appropriation. The fact that blues and jazz has been popularized by white artists when it was created by Black artists who weren't given the same airplay as their white counterparts.
Thank you. Those are helpful examples. So we have a question from Deborah Jackson here. It says, hi, Briana. Can you talk a bit about the difference between hermeneutical theft and cases in which socially marginalized people attempt to reclaim terms that have been used against them?
So differences between hermeneutical theft and cases of language reclamation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have been thinking about it a bit, but in truth, I can't, maybe I'm just being myopic, but I suppose I can't really think of any examples where I've seen this done successfully. So I remember in high school, I distinctly remember in high school, the NAACP having a funeral for the N-word. And then like when that didn't work, because it didn't work, there was some like idea of possibly reappropriating that term, and that didn't work either. I've seen attempts with the B word. I'm not going to curse on this particular talk. But I also, yeah, I can't think of any efforts that I've seen that are successful. But setting that aside, what would I think the differences are? I guess I'm inclined to think that there could be something empowering about reclaiming language that was created specifically to oppress. But it would help me to think more about this more clearly if I could think of some examples. And I'm a bit lost at the moment to do so.
Deborah noted the possibility of queer as an example.
Ooh,
Some food for thought.
Queer. Okay, I need to think on it some more. If an answer pops in my head, I will just return to this question if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, queer.
So Callie McCullough asks, how should we respond to hermeneutic theft and reduce harm to marginalized communities? How should we respond to that given what you're talking about tonight?
Oh, thank you so much. I really love this question because I don't in this talk give any like ideas for how to bypass it. But I think correcting people for one when they misuse the term. I think when it comes to intersectional oppression, maybe I'm being naive in saying this, but I hope that it ended up being misunderstood simply because people were trying to do the right thing, but went about it the wrong way because they didn't fully understand what the term meant. And so maybe that one really isn't malicious. But in cases of gaslighting, the reason I was particularly motivated to use that example is because I have seen some dominantly situated people respond to marginalized folks and say, you're gaslighting me right now. When really they're just saying like, you disagree with me and are making me feel like my opinion's invalid. And so I think it's very important in those sorts of cases, because gaslighting is not completely gone yet, to really clearly state, hey, that's not what that word means. Gaslighting requires manipulating some form of identity prejudice on our parts, and that's not what you're doing. What you're saying is merely disagreement with me, for instance, or what you're saying is that I'm lying, which I'm not. But trying to shift, to reintroduce into the common ground the accurate understanding of the term is one way to make sure hermeneutic theft is not successful in its project.
Thank you. So this question comes from Steve Gamboa. Thanks for a wonderful talk. Here's my question. Should these problems that you're outlining about appropriation and hermeneutical theft, should they make us question the efficacy of ameliorative semantic innovation that you were talking about?
That's a good question. Yeah. So no. Sorry, I don't know why it's gone fuzzy. Stop moving. No, it shouldn't. To some extent, whatever happens in the broader community, these terms, I think the creation of them within marginalized communities can be really empowering for us, even if it is for a limited amount of time before they're stolen and misrepresented. It can be really powerful to have them for that brief time, just for yourself to say, this really did happen to me. This really is unacceptable. I am not making this up. It allows you to attend to the robust aspect of your experiences in a way that you couldn't before. And I would never, I think to give up on the ameliorative project would be to give up on self-understanding of these communities in some ways. But it does perhaps, I've wondered about this a lot. When I've given talks on this subject before, the worry that I'm always confronted with is that I might place marginalized communities in a separate problem where they're dealing with epistemic exploitation. So if I'm right that these terms get sort of stolen and jumbled and mixed up once they are distributed intercommunally, then my suggestion might be something like, well, then we have to do more work on the front end to make sure that doesn't happen, to anticipate the ways in which the terms may be misunderstood or misrepresented or used against us. But then that just seems like an unjust burden on the marginalized who are already epistemically exploited very regularly. For myself, as Michael mentioned at the start of the talk, I run an outreach Corrupt the Youth. I run an outreach program called Corrupt the Youth. And since we're on hiatus right now because of COVID, one of the things that we're doing is creating lots of digital content. And one of the things that my students are currently working on is creating concept cards. So cards that we'll distribute that say like, here's what gaslighting is, and here's an example. So just doing more work to make sure that people know that these terms are there and that they have specific meanings and specific uses. So I don't think that's a burden that falls on everyone, but since I am committed to educating in these ways, it feels like a little antidote that I can offer to make sure that younger generations know this is what gaslighting means and this is about what it means, and they pick out two very different phenomena.
So thank you so much. So this question comes from Brittany Johnson, and Brittany notes how she liked how you mentioned the relationship between Blue Lives Matter as a slogan and the producers of that slogan as being responsible in some way for the silencing of the intent or meaning behind Black Lives Matter. Do you believe it is not just intersectionality at play, but a defacing or removal of agency on the part of those who try to corrupt the semantics behind Black Lives Matter that is an issue here? By removing a particular concrete meaning, it seems like there's less ability for the Black Lives Matter movement to gain traction in the political goals it intends to achieve.
Okay, full disclosure, I was reading that question on the screen at the same time as you were saying it, and so now I need to read it one more time, okay?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a rich question.
Yes, so to answer Brittany's question, yeah, for me, it is that the harm primarily has to do with the lack of agency that this causes. It's not like those three women responsible for the Black Lives Matter slogan just came up with that on a whim. You know, they knew that they were creating something that was going to bring a lot of attention to them, probably negative. They worked really hard to communicate something that should be obvious. I still really struggle with how anyone can misunderstand Black Lives Matter. And so, yeah, it really does undermine the agency, especially because it attributes to these groups all these malicious motives that they certainly don't have, in such a way that in itself is meant to devalue or undermine the movement. And so it's not just intersectionality, as you point out. It's intersectionality, it's Black Lives Matter, it's Femi Taiwo gives the example of identity politics, which I don't use in my material because I think it's slightly different from what I identify. But yeah, it takes these contributions that Black women in particular really strived and worked hard for, and it undoes all of that beautiful labor. And for me, that is the problematic aspect of hermeneutic theft, that it takes away the possibility for agency from a group of people who have always had their agency stripped from them.
Thank you. Some questions from Sinem Sinair, some interesting questions here. How do claims of reverse racism fit into your analysis? Is this a case of theft or a category mistake? Have you come across such claims as these kinds of claims in your Corrupt the Youth outreach program? And how do you respond to young adults' grievances of reverse racism when you encounter them?
Yes, also a very fascinating question. So how does reverse racism fit into my analysis? It doesn't, because I do think, as you suggested, it's just a category mistake. I think in those sorts of cases, so again, I don't use the example of racism as Anderson does, because I don't think the term racist was created specifically by marginalized communities or for marginalized communities. The concept of race, and then I imagine racism by extension, was created, this is going to be controversial, but it was created alongside the burgeoning capitalist industry of slavery to justify it, right? So I think when people say that, you know, affirmative action's racist, or you're being racist against this white person, it is people making a category mistake. But this is an interesting example because I have seen more conversations on my social media, at least lately, about whether racism just means discrimination on the basis of race, or if it requires discrimination on the basis of race with some sort of systemic power behind it. And I tend to take the more institutional approach to understanding what racism is, that it's not just discrimination on the lines of race, but there's this systemic power behind it, that it dominates institutions, that even if there weren't racist individuals, there's this legacy of racism in our institutions such that racism trickles down on the individual level. And so, yeah, I think in that sort of the reverse racism case, that is just a category error. But getting to your question about how I come across this in claims of corrupt the youth, and how would I respond to young adult grievances. I can't give examples here right now, but I will tell you that my strategy always is to not argue with people who make these sorts of claims. I make them argue with themselves. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Barclay's 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philanus, but it is a master class in how to troll someone that you're arguing with. So I highly recommend it, and it's accessible to everyone, even if you're not a philosopher. But the best strategy I've always found with people who are making claims that you know you can't dissuade them from is to just ask them questions and then let them talk, because the more they talk, the more they're going to say things that are inconsistent, and that opens them up to weaknesses. You can say, oh, look, this is a contradiction. If that's what you really think racism is, then you would have to agree that these things that we're describing as racism are really problematic. So that's my preferred approach, because it has occurred to me, and the wisdom that the 30s grants you, that some people are just not going to respond to positive arguments. And so it's best to be quiet, to listen, and to let them talk.
So thank you so much. So this is another anonymous question. So Thanksgiving holiday is coming up. And so dinner table conversations are going to be happening. What is your go-to common denominator way to explain hermeneutic theft or epistemic oppression in a family setting?
So first of all, I was just reading this article, I think it was in the Atlantic, about how, like, you shouldn't go home for Thanksgiving because COVID's still a problem. So, you know, be cautious at Thanksgiving dinner, unless there's someone, I guess, you intentionally want to get sick, but that still seems really messed up. But how would I say to talk about this at the dinner table? Honestly, use the Black Lives Matter example, because it's going to be the one people latch on to the best. I kind of feel like gaslighting and intersectionality are still most prevalent in academic circles. And so if you are like me, going home to family who's not in the academy, you want to give them an example that they're familiar with. And I think lots of people, even if they want to espouse that they agree with Black Lives Matter and they think George Floyd and Brianna Taylor were not done, the justice was not done right there, I think most people will still think that Black Lives Matter could be different or behave differently, but they'll respond positively to Blue Lives Matter because everybody loves cops, right? And so pointing out that just allowing them to talk out why they respond differently to Blue Lives Matter than Black Lives Matter gives you an entry point to have them observe the inconsistencies in their own reasoning, which is one of the reasons I say let them talk, because I think people are very good at acknowledging inconsistencies in their reasoning when they hear themselves say the things. But if you point it out for them, they're less likely to catch on.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's the example that I would go to.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question came in from, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the name, but are these Chelsea Powers King? And the question is, does the field of philosophy participate in hermeneutic theft? And if so, what can we do about it?
Hi, Kelsey. Probably it does. I can't think of any terms where it has done that off the top of my, oh, yes, I can actually. Okay. As you know, some of you, Christy Dotson wrote this paper called A Caution About Epistemic Oppression. And it was sort of a response to the Fricker book, which I don't think, so Fricker wrote this book, Epistemic Injustice, where she introduces hermeneutic injustice, testimonial injustice, and a whole bunch of other things. But what Dotson says in her paper that's a response to the book is this. That was actually discussed by Black women starting in like the 60s and 70s. And so one of the problems with Fricker there, even though what she does is super helpful, I mean, this was my entry point into this literature. But what she does there does seem to be an instance of hermeneutic theft, because she does take this idea that was developed in Black feminist scholarship, and she either didn't know it existed, which is still a failure on her part, because one of your obligations as a scholar is to do research on similar topics so that you know the full scale of literature that you might need to cite. Or she did know about it and she just failed to include it, which is a really egregious oversight on her part. I don't know, I can't speak for Fricker, but that does seem to me like an instance of hermeneutic theft in philosophy. All that to say, one of the reasons that it's helpful to have these sorts of talks, I think, is because, like I said, even those among us who strive to be morally good creatures, like, we're just going to make mistakes because we're human. And the project isn't to not make mistakes, it's to not keep making those same mistakes over and over again.
Thank you. And that, I think this ties in nicely to this next question here from Nate Olson. Does the intent of those who practice hermeneutical theft matter? All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter are intended to be in opposition to Black Lives Matter. But I can see examples of hermeneutical theft where someone might think they are honoring or celebrating a marginalized group.
Yeah, thank you for this question, Nate. I don't think I do believe that all cases of hermeneutic theft need to be malicious or ill-intended. Because again, recall that I don't suggest in my analysis anything that says to count as hermeneutic theft, it has to be maliciously done. Only that what's harmful about hermeneutic theft is that it has the silencing feature, and so undercuts the epistemic agency of those who are already epistemically marginalized. And so like I just said, yeah, it might be the case that Miranda Fricker's was an instance of not having ill intent at all, of trying to do honor to that legacy. I think that probably does happen fairly often.
Thank you so much. And those are the questions we have tonight, and we're just about at time anyway, so this is perfect. But I just want to thank everyone again for spending their evening with us. And I want to thank Dr. Toole for a wonderful talk and for being gracious with answering so many questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank y'all for being here.
All right, everybody, take care, be safe, and we will see you at the, well, actually, you know what? We have a couple comments here I just want to say. Thank you, Dr. Toole. This is from President Lynette Zelezny, President of CSU Bakersfield. Thank you, Dr. Toole. This has been a brilliant, fascinating, and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for illuminating the CSUB academic community. Thank you, Dr. Zelezny. Ali Diaz says, wonderfully spoken, and thank you. And Deborah Jackson says, sending you applause.
Thank you all.
And we have a question about the recording. I'll be sending out information about that. Recording the Kegley Institute of Ethics YouTube page is where we host recordings of all the events that we are able to record. So check the Kegley Institute of Ethics YouTube page. That's a great place to go for our resources, and our website, csub.edu/KIE. All right, thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Dr. Toole. We'll be seeing you all soon.